Hi, everyone. This is Dorie Clark. I am here with David Burkus, my friend. He's a fellow member of the Thinkers 50 list of top business thinkers, and he is the author of a new book, which is called Leading from Anywhere. And David and I are going to be talking today about exactly that, right? We have been over the past 9 months figuring out how to navigate this whole new world of work. And David is one of the leading experts in really understanding and piecing that together. David, I'm so glad to have you here.
Yeah, I know. Thank you so much for having me. I think if I remember right, I was one of your early LinkedIn Live experiments, and it was a ton of fun. So, I enjoy talking to you anytime, even if it's just coffee in person like we used to do. So, any excuse to talk with Dorie is a ton of fun.
Well, I appreciate the leap of faith. And yes, you're exactly right. We talked, gosh, it was like March or April of last year, because you are prolific. You had a book that actually came out less than a year ago called Pick a Fight, and which was also fantastic. But you were a man of the moment. And so now we're talking about leading from anywhere. And I'll just mention thank you to all of our great folks who are tuning in today to join us. Please type into the chat box where you're from. We want to see who you are. We want to say hi. So let us know where you're tuning in from. And of course, we're going to be taking your questions for David very soon. So feel free to type those in as well. So David, the first question that I have for you, I think, one of the most stressful elements, I guess, for a lot of people during the world of COVID and navigating this is actually maintaining connections and maintaining culture during all of this. Company culture used to be something that was transmitted, like, you walk in the building and you feel it. You can tell what it's like to work there. Now, in some ways you might say, well, is every company culture kind of the same because we're all doing it through these boxes? Like, how do you actually preserve what's special about a company? I mean, if you're a leader, people really, I know with my clients, they are really worrying about this. Like, how do you make sure you don't lose the special sauce? And this is something that you talk about quite a bit in Leading from Anywhere. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about it.
Yeah, the interesting thing is, it was obviously easier to build culture when you were all co-located, right? The irony is that a lot of people still didn't do it, right? Culture was built by accident. It was just sort of the things we do, the way we do things, what we believe, et cetera. And it wasn't deliberately designed. I mean, thriving companies, places known for their company culture, et cetera, were much more intentional about building culture than were your average co-located company. That hasn't changed, right? The same level of intentionality is still there. It's just the tactics that we have to use change a little bit. When we think about a thriving remote culture, we have to pay deliberate attention to a couple things that used to happen accidentally. The two biggest are a sense of what we call shared understanding, and shared identity is the second. And I'll define each in turn real quick. So shared understanding is the extent to which people on a team, for example, or even throughout the whole company, have an understanding of each other's knowledge, skills, and abilities. They have an understanding of the way people like to do work. I mean, it's big things like who knows what and how can I ask them for help, but it's also little things like who is responsive in the evenings and who is doing family time in the evenings, right? And so that we don't accidentally step on each other's toes. That shared understanding, that's a lot easier to build with the little nonverbals and the fact that you can just sort of walk down the hallway and knock on somebody's cubicle opening. I was about to say door, but I actually don't know what you call just the lack of felt in a cubicle opening. That was much easier to do. So a lot of people just didn't even do it deliberately. Smart companies did it deliberately, right? Now every company has to do it deliberately. We have to think about the ways that we're letting people understand the context that they're working in, which is a huge one. Back in April, May, and June, when everybody was still sort of adjusting to the great work from home experiment, the context people were working in was a lot different. I'm lucky enough to be interviewing you. I mean, you're in a penthouse in Miami, and I'm in about a 10 by 10 room in the basement of my house where my kids are at school, right? That's a way different context than some people on the team who might have bought a folding screen at Home Depot and put it in the corner of their dining room, and they use it to hide from their kids who at the other end of the dining room table are doing their virtual school. And if we don't take the time to understand each other's context, we're going to end up causing a lot of frustrations from that lack of understanding. So that's shared understanding. There's also the sense of shared identity, which is the extent to which I feel like the people that I'm working with are actually my team, and I draw my identity from them the way that they're a team. This is sort of the hurdle that I'm looking at in 2021. Shared understanding was sort of 2020's big hurdle. Shared identity will be 2021's as people start to come back in the office. I have no idea when in 2020, but I feel safe saying at some point in 2020, people will start trickling back in if they're not already. The problem there is that not everyone is going to come back to the office all of the time, and not all at once. And so the future of work is working from anywhere. And that creates a problem of identity because it can become really easy to think that my team is the people I see in person every day and not work to include the people who are working more remotely than others. And so there's a lot of things that we need to do to build that intentionality that it doesn't matter where you work, we're all one team, regardless of where you're located. So shared understanding and shared identity are probably the two big things to pay attention to if you're running a whole remote company or even just on your team to build a better culture remotely.
I think that's a really great point, David. Thank you very much for that. And if any of you guys who are tuning in hear particularly interesting things or insights that you want to capture and perhaps share with your fellow colleagues who are tuning in for our Newsweek Better series, make sure you capture them. For me, one thing that's standing out already is David's insight that shared understanding was the watchword of 2020. Shared identity and the cohesion of the culture is going to be the challenge for 2021, which I think is a really important insight. And I also just want to take a moment to say hi to some of the people who are tuning in. We're so glad you're here. Sophia from London, Raina from Chicago, Rosinda is here, Veronica from New Jersey, Hector from DC, Amulia from Hyderabad, Katie from New Jersey. We've got Shiva from Atlanta, Debbie from Atlanta, Rosinda from Mexico. This is so great. We have Janice from California, Louisa from Toronto, Errol from Turkey, Skip from Kansas. We love having you guys here. Thank you so much for tuning in, and make sure to type your questions for David into the chat box because we want to hear what is on your mind. Now, David, something that I'm really curious about, you actually are pretty experienced in talking about the world of work because you 2 books ago, or 3, if we can't pick a fight, you're very prolific. You had a book called Under New Management, where you were talking about innovative work styles and some of the new policies or techniques that the leaders, the real innovators in the workspace were doing. I'm actually curious if you could hold up Under New Management alongside Leading from Anywhere. These people who, 3 years ago when the book came out, the companies that were doing these really innovative things, how did they tackle COVID? Were they all better positioned, or what were the lessons that you learned from the innovators 3 years ago and how it's played out now that everyone has been thrown headfirst into the world of virtual work?
Yeah. So, I mean, the irony is that a lot of the companies profiled in Under New Management were remote or work from anywhere companies, right? Maybe they had an office, but you weren't required to be there, et cetera. The idea behind Under New Management was to look at a lot of what people were thinking were company fads and figure out which ones were permanent, right? And the irony, if you look at all of it, and I know I've said irony like 7 times, my apologies. There's just a lot.
It's all
of
ironic. I think 2020 and 2021 is just, it's totally inherently ironic.
But actually in that Janice Morissette way where it's actually just frustrating and none of it is ironic, it's more like that. But
yeah, anyway, Black Fly in the Chardonnay. I feel you, brother.
Right, totally. If you look at a lot of the companies that had a lot of these policies, you could summarize, and I used to do this in speeches and consulting, working with executives around Under New Management. I used to say, look, I don't know which of the policies in this book you should adapt. Here's what I know. You should figure out what is keeping your people from doing their best work and remove it, right? Because for most organizations, there's a distinct lack of trust and autonomy caused by what I often call policy creep. Right. So one person disrupts our trust. And as a result, we make a 14-page expense reimbursement policy to make sure that this never happens again. Instead of just being like, well, we fired that one person and we trust the rest of you until you give us a reason not to. Right. And when you give people a sense of trust and autonomy, ironically, a work from anywhere workplace sort of happens. It's usually an accident that as soon as you decide to give your people trust and autonomy, they end up saying, well, I don't have to be there all the time. I'll be here when I need to be. Trust me on that. But I know that I work more efficiently in other spaces, et cetera. So that would be the big thing I would say. And most of the companies, obviously companies like Buffer that I profile, they're doing fine in a remote work world, other than they're not able to do their annual all company gathering and their every 6-month team gatherings and that sort of stuff, which are, I think, a big part of our future in a work from anywhere world is that meetups do matter. But most of them, if they were grounded in trust and autonomy, have managed the pivot really well because that's been their guiding principle for how they set any of these policies. The ones that really haven't managed all that well are the ones that didn't have that. And so they were asking questions. Do you remember this? In April and May and June, they were asking questions like, what spying software should I use to make sure that my employees are at their laptops? And there were people marketing a software that would take screenshots using your employee's webcam every 5 minutes to show you that they were in front of their computer. And it's one of those things where if you are looking for that type of software, you screwed up on the trust and autonomy thing a long time ago. And we have a way bigger problem we need to solve before we can figure out what the best software is, which is none of them.
The best software is none of them. So true, David Burkus. Thank you. That's amazing. So we have some great questions that came in from our viewers here. So thanks, guys, for tuning in. If you're enjoying this conversation, make sure you hit the like button and hit the share button so that your friends can benefit from David's insights and from all of the cool stuff that we're doing on the Newsweek Better series. But a question came in from Hector that I think is probably on a lot of people's minds. He wants to know, David, what's the best way to understand the current culture within an organization and how it has to change in order to maintain the right productivity? If you are a leader and you're wondering, okay, well, what is the culture now? Like, how do I we know we want to get to this place, but how do we even articulate what our culture is? What are your thoughts about that, about identifying the current culture and then using that to be able to bridge the gap?
Yeah, so I think there's I look at culture as sort of three, if you remember the old school stereo systems we all used to have before we just listened to music on our phone in a highly compressed fashion, there was the equalizer, right? And the treble and the bass and I look at culture like that, but there's only three dials that you need to be thinking about, or sliders that you need to be adjusting. We already talked about two, shared understanding and shared identity. Those overlap really nicely with what we know from, for example, the Google Project Aristotle study, which is a massive study run not only by Google, but by some of the world's best organizational psychologists. Shared understanding, shared identity, and then also a sense of psychological safety. And this is obviously where a lot of companies screw up. There are horror stories of lack of psychological safety. So I would be looking at those three to figure out which one we should be working on first, right? Do our people have a sense of shared understanding? And you can do that in a couple different ways. You can do that by asking them, do you understand the roles and responsibilities of you? Do you know how to ask for help if you need to ask for help? But you can also sense it in other ways, like are people feeling like they have to be always on because there isn't an understanding of appropriate response times, those sort of things. Shared identity, that has to do with the sense that people feel like they're actually on a team and the sense of purpose and meaning that they draw from their work. So you would want to use questions specific to your organization, obviously, but you would want to use questions that investigate that. And then psychological safety is actually really pretty easy as a leader to judge. I know this sounds, there's so much research on this from people like Amy Edmondson, and she's going to be horrified that I'm simplifying it this way, but here's my litmus test for psychological safety. When was the last time one of your people disagreed with you? If it's greater than a week, you don't have the right level of psychological safety on your team. If it's greater than a year, it's sort of like the trust and autonomy thing. You messed up a long time ago, right? So that's my simple, and don't ask anybody else that. Just think back to the last time one of your people felt comfortable speaking up in front of you. And if it's a long time, then you don't have as much psychological safety as you think you do.
I think that's a great rule of thumb and very useful. So thank you for that, David. So a great question actually came in from Sophia. She wanted to know, how should leaders manage multi-generational workforces, which is a huge challenge now more than ever. It was hard enough before figuring out, the crazy millennials and the crazy Gen Z and cracking the code on all of these things. But now it's being done virtually. Sometimes, I know this is a chapter that you have in Leading from Anywhere. You are hiring people, you're onboarding people, you haven't even met them. How do you handle the multi-generational aspect from remote, David?
Yeah, so this is something that honestly I'm paying a lot of attention to because I still don't know the answers, right? Fully. I'll give you some places of where to look. But a great indication of this is that we don't even know what to call Gen Z yet. Right? Remember when we called the millennials Gen Y and then we found out what their name was? Like, we haven't even done that with Gen Z. So we still don't know a lot about that. And we also don't know, as offices open up and as some people trickle back and don't know who. there's a lot of assumptions that the sort of boomers and late Gen Xers whose kids are grown or are maybe in college or high school and don't require as much caretaking are going to be the ones who come first back to the office. I actually think I sort of see the inverse too. I think like the Gen Z and late millennials who are still childless and possibly not even, paired up with a spouse are going to want to come back to cities and come back to the office as a form of social environment as well. I think it's going to be that middle category, but I also don't know, right? Because I know a lot of people who love going to the office right now to get away from their kids, whose kids are at small ages, right? So I don't really know what the impact of the world sort of opening up again and everybody having flexibility. I don't know where it's going to shake down. I do know this, though, is that lack of understanding makes what we were talking about before, shared understanding, even more important. I don't know what the prescription is for an entire company, but I know what the prescription is for your team, which is that we need to be having the conversation about how and when we can work together. We need to be working on things like, I'm a huge fan of the team working agreement, right? Or the social contract of a team, or what I sometimes call the Declaration of Interdependence, right? Which is a document that we come up with as a team that outlines, this is how we're going to work together. This is what we define as a reasonable response to an email, for example. And this is where we agree to use Slack versus email versus a Zoom call. And this is how we want to make requests for help so that everybody knows. Sometimes people make requests for help that are so passive we don't actually know. And a week later, they're frustrated because no one's helping them. All of that flushes out. And we come up with an agreement of this is how we're going to work together. And in coming up with that agreement, you end up learning about the context that people are working in. And so you start to figure out what works for your team. And that's really the only thing I think we can be doing right now to solve the multi-generational issue is solve it for your team by figuring out the context they're working in. And then maybe by the end of 2021 or into 2022, we're going to have a sense of, hey, here's where how much time at the office and how much time at home broke down by generation. But we don't know that yet because for a lot of places, it's not even open.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really useful, David. And it's true. We are still figuring things out. I mean, the history is being written as we speak right now. So just a reminder for all of you guys tuning in, if you want to make sure you never miss a fantastic episode of our Newsweek Better interview series, it's every Thursday, noon Eastern, 9 Pacific, 5 o'clock in London. And if you subscribe to my newsletter, you can do it at dorieclark.com. You will get notices and notifications and make sure that you don't miss anything. You can download a free self-assessment and thereby get subscribed to my newsletter. Our guest next week, 1 week from today, is named Vivek Tiwari. He is a Tony nominated Broadway producer, and he's actually going to be talking about how to persevere and how to keep your team going and motivated in the face of what is one of the worst shutdowns in the entire American economy. Broadway ain't going nowhere right now, but somehow you still have to keep the team unified, and he's going to be talking about that. So we're really excited for that next week, 1 week from today. And now, of course, we're talking with our friend David Burkus about leading from anywhere. And David, a great question came in from Anne. She's actually looking for a job right now. And she's curious, if you're interviewing from remote, if you haven't met these people in person, what are the tells? How can you actually figure out what the culture of the company is, even when you're evaluating it from remote?
Yeah. And so, and first of all, God love you and keep persisting. This is probably like I'm a millennial. A lot of millennials. I mean, I'm like I could be Gen X if I didn't want to just own it. But a lot of them graduated into 2008, and what they said was the worst environment to go find a job in, and then were very quickly proven wrong by this, right? So keep persevering on that. I would say the best thing you can do is find any way you can to talk to as many people you'll be working with as possible. We had this terrible habit, even in a co-located office, of I almost described it as like speed dating. Like the average job interview was you would speed date with who would be your manager. Maybe you would meet their parents, meaning their supervisor, right? And then they'd make a decision to spend the next 40 hours a week of the next 3 to 5 years of their life alongside you based on 4 hours of FaceTime, right? But one of the things we know is that talent flows from teams. The team you're on is going to have a massive impact. Not the manager. The manager is important, but the team you're on is going to have a massive impact on that as well. So I would be asking if you could talk to other people as you're making that decision. You obviously can't do this until you're later in the interview rounds, but that would be what I would be working for. And when I say talking, by the way, I mean video like this, I mean audio, I mean text, because you're going to be communicating in all three formats. and you want to get a sense of how all three formats work, so you know, oh, I could actually fit with this, right? If I'm the type of person that likes to write those short, like 2-sentence emails, and when I work with somebody who likes to write the 4 or 5 paragraph things that cover multiple different topics, I know that that person and I are not going to communicate all that well in that medium. And so I want to know that going in. And so the best way to do that is to talk to as many people on your future or hopefully future team as you can in as many mediums as you can.
Love that, David. Thank you very much. And if you're tuning in here, please feel free to type your questions into the chat box for David Burkus. We want to hear what's on your mind. And David, a great question came in from Teresa. She's curious about employee wellness initiatives, for instance, employee resource groups. She said, do you think that that they are going to need to be stepping up their efforts and their visibility inside companies to help employees adapt to the new work-life normal? You know, if you have employees that are struggling, you know, whether it's struggling with the logistics of things, struggling oftentimes with the emotional impact of, you know, all the crazy things that we've been forced to do. You know, we're stuck at home. We've got too many family members around, or we've got not enough family members around. You know, all the different manifestations.
Seems like it's always one of those two, by the way. No one's like, I have the right number of family members around.
Yeah, no one thinks that. So, you know, these people are struggling, obviously. I mean, we have just been through sort of a collective societal trauma, for lack of a better term. So how should companies be responding to this? Not just an individual manager, but, you know, sort of more writ large. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, so I think this is inside a larger resetting of what benefits and larger programs like that are going to be, right? Mental health is going to be a huge component of this, not only because of the current crisis that we're facing, but again, if not everyone wants to come back all of the time, or not everyone feels safe at the same time. I saw in the comments, for example, Diane had a great thing about, older people are more concerned about exposing their elderly parents. That's totally true right now. I don't know how long it'll be true for, but again, even then, right, there will be some people who are concerned longer than others, right? And there'll be some boomers who have elderly parents and some who don't, right? So there's a whole bunch of things in there. So overall, yes, the visibility needs to step up. The way we think about benefits needs to step up. I think actually one of the best things we could do for people who don't want to be at the office all of the time is start thinking about ways we can provide access to shared spaces, again, when it's safe to do so that they don't feel like they're alone working from their house all of the time, right? And so that'll be things like we'll be adding co-working space memberships in some companies to the benefits package, right? We'll be spending maybe some of the money we save on office space, bringing people back together with the sole intent of bonding. But yes, those systems, making the systems visible for people who are struggling. If that was done a year ago, I think we probably would have managed parts of this crisis a whole lot better if people inside organizations knew what resources were available to them in those capacities. So I do think that needs to step up. Here's where I struggle is I don't want to make predictions about what that's going to look like, kind of like the multi-generational thing, right? They're important now. They'll definitely be important in 2021. But if we don't get them visible now, then we probably won't get the clout we need to figure out where we need to go. And so now's the time to be fighting for that. Or as one person just put in the comments, #banish burnout. Yes, now is the time to be thinking about that. Not only to banish burnout now, but so that we have those systems in place when we go back. My biggest fear is that we're going to end up in a place in late 2021 or 2022 where it's safe, maybe everybody's vaccinated, or everybody who wants to be or whatever, and companies just go, okay, come on back, because that's not going to work, right? You don't send 100 million people to work from home for a year and then just be like, come on back. It doesn't happen. And the things that we build now in this great work from home experiment are going to help us manage that transition. So I absolutely agree. It sounds like, Teresa, it sounds like you're already in that mentality. So keep fighting for that inside your own organization. I wish more leaders realized how important that was. But the next best thing we can do is make them realize that.
Yeah, such a good point, David. Thank you very much. And we have time for just a few more questions. And a great one came in from one of our viewers here on LinkedIn. They wanted to know something that I think is probably on a lot of people's minds, which is how, oh, no, that is not it. Although we are, we are very glad to have your comment, Hélène. So thank you. This one is the one that I wanted to hit, which is how do you balance flexibility and accountability? I mean, this is sort of the perennial polarity that we have to manage, right? I mean, people are going through a lot. As a good leader, you need to be sympathetic. You need to understand. But at the end of the day, there's also results that need to be gotten. So how can you actually thread that needle effectively, especially when you're leading from remote, David?
Yeah. So I want to be fully honest about this, which is that the bar was really low before the great work from home experiment started, right? Most organizations were already terrible at this. And we know this because so many of them associated presence with productivity, right? When are you here? How often are you here? Well, then you're obviously a hard worker. And because we were using annual, or like in the shortest sense, sometimes quarterly performance management systems, like it took forever to deal with problem colleagues who were not being held accountable, right? Or were taking advantage of flexibility, et cetera. So there were probably changes we needed to make before this began. But, best time to plant a tree 20 years ago versus today, right? Today, we need to be thinking about the fact that we need to be holding people accountable for outcomes, not just monitoring their presence. That's why the spying software stuff doesn't work. And we need to be teaching teams to the best thing I ever heard is from I think our mutual friend, Chris Taylor at Actionable, teaching teams to work out loud. Right? Teaching them what system we're going to use. And this usually comes out of the team working agreement, but what system are we going to use to know what each other are working on every given day and know what issues we're coming up with? I think we're going to see what used to be called sort of the scrum, the daily stand-up in scrum, the quick little meeting about what did I work on yesterday? What am I working on today? And where do I need help? That system is going to need to be a lot more frequent. Maybe it's once a week, right? Some companies do it as use a project management software for it. Some companies use a Google spreadsheet. We don't need a complicated system here. But teaching people that it's totally okay to spend a lot of time and a lot of flexibility working solo. It's not okay to not be communicating what you're working on, because then we don't know what problems you're facing and how we can help them. But also then we create the ability for people to take advantage of that flexibility. And I think when that happens, then we don't actually need to be thinking too much about performance management systems and performance improvement plans and all those things we actually used to do just to figure out how to fire someone legally. I think if we create that system for our team on how they're going to work out loud, then there's a peer-to-peer accountability there that is a beautiful thing to watch, something that should have happened in co-located teams and something that has to happen in remote teams or it's going to fall apart.
That's great, David. We have time for one more question. Before we do it, I just want to remind you guys, if you are curious to learn more about David's work, you can go to his website, davidburkus.com, which is the hub for all things David Burkus. And his book is called Leading from Anywhere. If you would like to make sure you never miss one of these super cool Thursday interview series, you can go to dorieclark.com/LinkedIn and subscribe to my LinkedIn weekly newsletter, where you get updates and links to tune in. So we look forward to having you there. And I'll also suggest, as a great way of solidifying your own knowledge and just capturing some of the great insights, please type into the chat box the number one insight that you've gotten out of this conversation, or the thing that you're going to be thinking about or acting on based on what David has said. So the last question, David, that I wanted to ask you comes from Joseph in Dublin. And Joseph wanted to know, what are the key skills or skill sets you think that management needs to cultivate in order to better manage fully remote teams and maximize their productivity? If you can only, I mean, there's a million things they could work on.
Exactly.
One or two, what would you say is most important?
So I would say the first one is actually what we were talking about before, which is eliminate that. If it hasn't already been removed from your mind via what we've been living through, eliminate that equation between presence and productivity, because it was never true before. And unfortunately for a lot of people, presence became responsiveness when we went remote, right? And so suddenly we just think that the employees who reply to our emails fastest are our most productive ones. The reality is, if they're doing that, it's because they're not doing deep work that actually creates long-term productivity. So that would be one. The second thing I would encourage a lot of people to do is to learn how to take a more active coaching role. It's really hard, and somebody said this in the comments, it's really hard to thread the needle or to walk that line between managing on a shorter time frame of a week to 2 weeks of everybody working out loud and not letting people feel like you're micromanaging them. And so the people that learn the skills of coaching, I'm a big fan of also our mutual friend Michael Bungay Senior's book, The Coaching Habit, which outlines kind of 7 questions that I see as a great set of questions you could use for your weekly or your every other week, your check-ins, et cetera. But learn how to take that more coaching approach right? And as somebody said, succinct leadership, sharing that point of view and sharing expectations is definitely needed. And then making it clear that you are there to help people meet those expectations. Your job is to help your people do their best work. It's not for them to help you, right? So flip that mentality in your mind as well. And the best way to do that is to learn how to coach.
Love that, David Burkus. Again, if you want to learn more about David and his new book, Leading from Anywhere, go to davidburkus.com. If you want to make sure that you are always tuned in to these great Thursday interview series and also get a free self-assessment, you can go to my website at dorieclark.com. So happy to have all of you wonderful folks here tuning in. And David Burkus, we are especially happy to have you as our guest. Thank you.
Oh, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everyone, and see you next week.